world of work is changing at an incredible pace as technology transforms how we work and what work we do. The International Organization of Employers, Ioe, and its over 150 independent member organizations are on the forefront of these changes, assisting the 50 million companies we represent to adapt to the future of work.
And I would say that Ioe in recent years has helped our membership navigate some of the current global challenges that are faced by companies.
Being the member of the Ioe brings us onto the global platform.
Que para nosotros y para todas las cámaras empresariales o organizaciones de empleadores es fundamental poder contar con la OIE, más en un momento donde estamos viviendo una transformación del trabajo muy importante.
Ioe's purpose is to create a sustainable global economic environment that is fair and beneficial to both business and society. The strength of Ioe is its global network. We are proud of bringing the united voice of employers and business organizations to the International Labour Organization and to lead that business voice across the United Nations system, the G20, the G7, and other high-level international forums. Ioe works across an array of policy areas, from sustainable development to regular labor migration, greening economies, business and human rights, and skills and productivity.
Within the UN, within the global community, the Ioe should emerge as the true voice of employers, being at the table where policies are made, being seen as the lead organization, the to-go-to organization when it comes to matters employment and social policy.
The Ioe needs to stay the course. They need to remain a positive voice for private enterprise, the role of business, not just in our economies and not just for jobs, but for the social progress of our communities and what we can achieve as societies throughout the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, where you are, and welcome to the Ioe Centenary Summit. Today, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the International Organization of Employers. For 100 years, the Ioe is the global voice of business. We were originally founded in March 1920 to coordinate the view of business within the ILO. We are very happy to have with us today ILO Director General Guy Ryder to discuss with him not only the contributions that employers have made over the past 100 years to the ILO, but more importantly, the role of employers at the ILO in the future. We do not only want to celebrate past achievements, but we want to look ahead and direct the organization, direct the global business community into the next centenary. That is the reason we are launching today the Ioe Centenary Manifesto. It outlines our vision for the Ioe's role as a key player in an interconnected world and reconfirms our values, intentions, ambitions, and aspirations. The Ioe Vice Presidents for Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin and North America will speak to the manifesto and its significance for their region. They will speak on behalf of our members, the National Business and Employers Organization in 150 countries around the world, representing more than 50 million companies. The strength of the Ioe has been always its global network. The Ioe members are the representative and legitimate voice of business. They are the organizations which have a key role to play at national level in policymaking and social dialogue. They have a huge convening power and bring together not only the large companies, but also the small and medium-sized companies, which are the backbone of all economies. When we celebrate today the Ioe, we celebrate particularly also the commitment and engagement of our members. In the last 100 years, our scope has vastly expanded, and we represent business not only within the ILO, but across the UN system, the G20, G7, and many other forums. We are very proud that the UN Secretary General António Guterres will join us today to discuss with us how we can strengthen multilateralism and collaboration with business. This is today more important than ever before. The disastrous economic, health, and employment impact of COVID-19 demands all hands on deck, demands much better collaboration, obliges all of us to grow beyond ourselves. The IOE and its global network is fully committed to work with the UN and all stakeholders to do whatever it takes to address the impact of the pandemic. We will discuss in the last panel how we can build back better and the concrete role of business in that. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we have a full-packed program today. Let me directly hand over to Claire Dool, our Master of Ceremony today. I wish us all intense and fruitful discussion and declare the Ioe Centenary Summit open. Claire, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mr. President, and indeed, thank you for everybody joining us from far and wide to mark the 100th anniversary of IOE, and as Mr. President was saying, to discuss the Century of Action Manifesto and one of its really important themes, which is multilateralism and business. But before we get down to business, a few housekeeping points. We really do want to hear your questions, so please do put your questions in the chat box and say who you would like to answer that question. And of course, do tweet at hashtag IOE100. And exactly as Mr. President said, we are delighted that the UN Secretary General António Guterres will be joining us at about 4 o'clock. Before that, we have the Director General of the ILO, Guy Ryder, and we have the 5 regional vice presidents of IOE, who are going to be discussing the challenges that the organization and the world is facing in the next 20 years. But before we go live, let's hear some video messages from those 5 regional presidents.
En este inquietante y desafiante escenario pandémico, con repercusiones en todas las relaciones personales, de consumo y laborales, el centenario de la Organización Internacional de Empleadores cobra aún más importancia, porque de hecho somos la voz mundial del sector privado. Pretendemos continuar como protagonistas clave en el futuro, renovando nuestros valores, ambiciones y aspiraciones por un mundo laboral cada vez mejor. Nunca ha sido tan necesaria la sostenibilidad de las empresas para la recuperación y creación de empleo, la generación de inversiones e innovaciones capaces de impulsar nuestras economías. Es necesario reforzar el papel de la OIE y su incansable labor, basado en principios y valores claros, defendiendo la economía de mercado como la mejor base para el progreso económico. Quedan muchos desafíos por delante y nuestra región tiene muchos problemas para enfrentar. Mejorar las bases para incrementar la economía y el empleo formal, mejorar la interacción entre los interlocutores sociales, adoptar políticas de empleo eficaces para los jóvenes, las mujeres y los grupos desfavorecidos. Mejorar el diálogo social y el tripartismo con una mejora de las relaciones entre las organizaciones empresariales y las organizaciones internacionales es fundamental. Es claro que las organizaciones internacionales y los gobiernos no pueden resolver estos problemas globales por sí solos. Necesitan más que nunca el apoyo y el esfuerzo colaborativo del sector privado para crear un entorno propicio para el crecimiento sostenible e inclusivo y la creación de empleo productivo y trabajo decente para todos. Sin empresas sostenibles no podemos hablar de empleo productivo, trabajo decente y oportunidades. El centenario de la OIE es una gran oportunidad para destacar el rol positivo de la empresa en la sociedad. Los desafíos son enormes, pero no insuperables, incluso frente a la pandemia. Juntos somos simplemente más fuertes.
It is my great honor to speak on behalf of employers in Asia and the Pacific. Asia and the Pacific is the most diversified in terms of level of development, size of population and land, ethnicities, cultures, and languages. But I'm sure that we would like most is that our voices could be heard by other stakeholders at the national, regional, and international level. In March 2019, B20 Tokyo Summit joint recommendations pointed out pandemic could cause not only imminent danger to large number of human lives, but also negative impact to the economy and the international relations. G20 should create cross-country platform to ensure pandemic preparedness and response so as to minimize its negative impact on the society. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but we assume that there are many voices not being heard from the private sector. We expect that the private sector should more engage in policy formulation of UN and its agencies. We believe that the collaboration of UN teams and the private sectors could accelerate to solve many challenges and reach targets set by the SDGs.
The Ioe Centenary is an event for celebration. It marks 100 years of constructive and proactive engagement of employers in shaping international employment policy and contributing to the functioning of multilateral institutions, especially the International Labour Organization, but also relevant organizations within the United Nations family. The economic crisis triggered by the measures taken to contain and combat the COVID-19 virus is serious and will require combined efforts of all actors, including employers' organizations represented in the Ioe. The Centenary Manifesto of the International Organization of Employers, together with the Centenary Declaration of the International Labour Organization that was adopted in 2019, provide an excellent basis for making the right policy choices to overcome the crisis and pave the way for sustainable and employment-rich recovery.
Le manifeste du centenaire de l'OIE tombe à pic alors que l'Afrique, comme les autres régions du monde, traverse une crise sanitaire, économique et sociale sans précédent causée par la pandémie du Covid-19. Il nous rappelle le rôle irremplaçable du secteur privé comme interlocuteur et partenaire clé des pouvoirs publics pour vaincre les conséquences de cette crise et créer ainsi les bases d'une reprise économique et durable et inclusive. Pour que le secteur privé puisse remplir le rôle qui est le sien, nous, organisations d'employeurs d'Afrique, appelons les pouvoirs publics à faciliter le développement du secteur privé en tant que principale source de croissance économique et de création d'emplois par la promotion d'un environnement favorable à l'entrepreneuriat et aux entreprises durables. En particulier, les micro, petites et moyennes entreprises ainsi que les coopératives de l'économie sociale et solidaire afin de générer du travail décent, de parvenir au plein emploi productif et d'améliorer les niveaux de vie pour tous. Les entreprises en Afrique ont besoin de stabilité juridique dans tous les domaines et de visibilité de politiques publiques transparentes, d'administration publique qui accompagne les entreprises dans leur action de production, d'accès au crédit et de jeunes bien formés pour pouvoir prospérer et remplir ainsi leur mission sociétale de création de richesses et d'emplois dans un continent jeune et dynamique. En Afrique, les fédérations d'employeurs sont très actives et sont engagées dans un dialogue permanent avec les organisations internationales actives sur le continent. En dehors de l'OIT, dont nous sommes acteurs par la structure tripartite de cette organisation, nous sommes aussi engagés de plus en plus activement auprès d'autres organisations, aussi bien continentales, la Banque africaine de développement, ainsi que globales, comme les Nations Unies et d'autres agences spécialisées. La contribution d'employeurs, des organisations d'employeurs en tant que voix des entreprises en Afrique au débat de l'heure qui concerne le continent, amélioration économique et sociale, renforcer l'intégration régionale avec la création d'une zone de libre-échange, lutte contre les changements climatiques, promotion de l'entrepreneuriat et de la diversité. La formalisation de l'économie, la migration est de plus en plus reconnue et sollicitée par tous les acteurs internationaux. Nous sommes un interlocuteur incontournable mais fiable et en même temps exigeant des organisations internationales sur tous ces sujets qui concernent l'avenir de l'Afrique et des Africains.
Ioe recognized in its manifesto that as a society we still face huge challenges, including persistent unemployment, weak growth, and poverty. Social protection systems are under pressure in all economies. The pandemic has only exacerbated these challenges. How work is done and organized is being transformed. A key challenge ahead is to ensure that people are enabled, not marginalized, by technological progress and that opportunities are fully realized. This at a time when the positive impact of globalization and free trade is increasingly being undermined, and rising protectionism risks jeopardizing the economic and social gains achieved to date. Against this backdrop, Ioe's manifesto states full support for the UN 2030 Development Agenda as a means to tackle the issue and seize opportunities, particularly SDG 8, with its ambitious targets of higher levels of economic productivity, entrepreneurship, and innovation, and for SDG 17 for a revitalization of the global partnership. USCIB and the North American employer community express our full support for these goals. You know, COVID-19 has put into sharp relief the depth of global interdependence and the need to build back better together toward the new reality for business and society. Multilateral institutions, including the UN and ILO, are the vehicles to ensure that we have an all-out collective and coordinated effort to build back better. We've been fortunate to partner with Ioe on USCIB's All-In initiative, whose clear message is multilateralism matters to business, and which is seeking practical ways to provide business engagement with the UN as a resource for implementation. We are convinced that converging sustainability and COVID response and recovery imperatives at the global level depends on inclusive multilateralism working with the private sector every step of the way. North American employer federations, including USCIB and its members, are dedicated to doing our part as employers to advance the UN decade of delivery and action and recovery on economic, social, and environmental fronts. USCIB will use its recent accreditation to UN ECOSOC to supplement Ioe's own status and work in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the 5 regional vice presidents there for stressing the importance of multilateralism to business and indeed the importance of having an enabling environment for business and in particular SMEs. And I'm delighted to say that all 5 regional vice presidents are now joining us live to discuss the Century of Action Manifesto and the challenges that lie ahead in the next 20 years. But perhaps before we move ahead, I'm going to ask first Hiroyuki to tell us in your region, in the Asian region, what has been the impact of Ioe work on business?
Thank you for asking question. And as I mentioned in my video message, our region is the most diversified in terms of development, culture, and ethnicities, and so on. That's why, and I cannot say we can just, to depend on the IOE activities. But what I emphasize most is, regardless level of development of each countries, we would like the most is to our voices could be more heard. On behalf of Asian Pacific employers, IOE could be a voices of throughout the world. That's why we strongly expect IOE to engage in activities, UN itself and its agencies as far as possible. That I would like to point it out at this moment. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, and indeed for stressing the importance of IOE not only in Asia but across the world. I would like to put the same question to Alexandre, Regional Vice President in Latin America, and how you have seen the impact of IOE's work on business in your region. If you've got a good example, I think that is always something that helps understanding.
Thanks, Claire. I apologize, but I will answer in Spanish because respecting my region. Yo creo.
Personally, Claire, I think that I can probably give you more than one example about what IOE has been doing and is indeed continuing to do in order to defend and protect freedom of enterprise, private property, and the freedom of association of both our members and our leaders in Latin America. For example, our members in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Venezuela, among other countries, could testify personally to what the IOE has been doing in order to defend their associations and their leaders' right to enjoy the freedom of association, which is often being trampled all over by the authorities in their countries. IOE has on many occasions expressed its deep concern at situations of political confrontation which are endangering the freedom of association, private property, free business activity, and indeed the creation of decent work and access to employment in Latin America. Unfortunately, and despite that, in some countries we still see harassment of the private sector being carried out by the government authorities, and that affects legal clarity and security, which in its turn puts obstacles in the way of business development and growth. IOE has always supported our members in these situations, and I hope will continue to do so for the next century, indeed, if necessary, for the next two. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Indeed, and in reinforcing that point of the importance of freedom of association and the concerns that you have about your members being harassed in your region. The IOE's Century of Action Manifesto looks ahead to the 2030 agenda, and IOE and the UN Secretary General has said even before the pandemic that the world is not going to meet those SDGs. It's lagging behind. So the big question, of course, is, given the public health crisis, given the economic crisis, how is the UN and the private sector going to work together to ensure that we do have sustainable growth, decent work, and more jobs? I'm going to ask Renata from the Vice President of Europe, first of all, to give us your thoughts on what do we do, given the challenges that we're facing, to meet those SDGs.
Thank you very much. And let me first of all repeat my congratulations to the IOE, especially to our President Errol Kiresepi, and also to Secretary General Roberto and Deputy Secretary General Matthias for their excellent preparation of this conference. It's a real pleasure to see and hear you all here, even if it's only via video conference. The region I represent in the IOE is actually much larger than Europe. It is Europe and Central Asia. And this region is characterized by a very great diversity. I think we have the largest number of countries among the regions in the UN family and the UN system and the ILO system. And these countries are extremely diverse. And this diversity has also manifested itself in the measures which were taken to contain the COVID-19 virus. What we need to do now is to analyze and assess the measures and their effectiveness, but also their economic and social impacts. Because what we see is that in some countries, there are highly restrictive measures with huge social and economic damages were taken. Damages especially for the real economy, while certain sectors like the IT sector ended up as the great commercial winner. You just need to look at the shares indices and the share prices. And this is, of course, a great imbalance which has been produced by these measures, because life takes place in reality, in real economy. It doesn't take place in the virtual world, in the second life, whatever it's called. And this is why the most urgent thing to do is to redress the real economy, to make real social relations, a real life possible again. And this is exactly what the IOE has been standing for, because the IOE is the network of global cooperation of employers' organizations. And I'm sure we would not have survived 100 years as organization had we not been able to meet in person at 3 times a year, at least, linked to ILO conferences, meet in person and network and build the contacts, build the consensus necessary for a united employer's voice. And this employer's voice is, as Peter Robinson actually said in his video, very much focused on multilateralism. Multilateralism has had its high times in the 1990s. Let me remind all of us, and I hope the Secretary General of the United Nations is there as well, in 1996, the G7 conclusions of Lyon, they said very clearly, we place a high priority on efficient, dynamic, respected, and open multilateral systems, on avoiding taking trade and investment measures which are unilateral. And this is a reality from which we have moved very, very far away, and to which we have to move again. And the IOE is the one organization which can contribute to this, because it is the link with the real economy. And that's why it needs to have a stronger and a more institutionalized voice also in the United Nations, not only in the ILO. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renata, indeed, for that strong commitment to multilateralism. Let me now pass to the Regional Vice President of Africa, Mahfoud, to get your thoughts in this very challenging environment, and given that we do need to meet the SDG targets. How do you see government and the private sector coming together? I am going to bring in Mahfoud as soon as I possibly can.
Okay, merci. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that, as you said in the question, the achievement of these objectives, these SDGs, is already a bit late, and now the environment is even more difficult. But we shouldn't lose sight of the objectives, nor hope of the objectives, the global objectives and all the targets which have to be achieved. And for this, United Nations have to contribute their assistance to the African employee organizations, the IOE, of course, to be able to achieve the objectives set forth by the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now let me ask Peter, Regional Vice President of North America, given the challenging circumstances that the world finds it's in, plus the 2030 agenda, how do you see private sector and the UN working closer and better together?
Well, I'll give you an example, Claire. As I intimated earlier, business and employers groups can be critical catalysts, I think, at all levels to support action by governments and the UN in converging the decade of delivery with COVID-19 response and recovery imperatives. And one example of such a business-led multi-stakeholder effort is business partners to convince, with the objective to advance vaccine acceptance in the workplace. It's interesting that research has shown that employers are among the most trusted sources of information to employees about health issues and vaccine issues. So employers worldwide can be trusted influencers in making the case for the need for vaccination in order to promote a safe return to workplaces and fully restart the global economy. So we'll be looking forward to working with Ioe and others on that in an effort to support UN and governmental initiatives.
Peter, just to keep you on the line there, because if we look at the relationship between multilateralism and the private sector, this has been something that for many years has been talked about, that they need to be closer. So can you give me some ideas, some concrete specifics about what does business want from the multilateral system so that it becomes an enabling environment?
Well, I think it's a matter not of only what we want from the multilateral system, but what we need. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the UN is essential to meeting present and future challenges in ways that no national government can tackle alone. So in line with UN 75 and the ambition to build a resilient, meaningful UN for the next 100 years, we need transparency and full inclusion of all business sectors that can bring practical solutions to bear. I think we see as indispensable the provision of business expertise and partnership as resources to member states and the UN systems as a whole in COVID response and recovery, sustainable development, and ensuring that no one is left behind.
Thank you very much, Peter. Full transparency and inclusion. The Director General of the ILO is writing that all down as he listens to you. Let me ask then the same question to Mahfoud about what you want, but also, as Peter has just said, what you need from the multilateral system. Mahfoud, if you could give us your thoughts.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, good morning again. Well, indeed, what we would like to have from the United Nations system is to be able to work hand in hand to be able to evolve, because the economy today can only be developed. The enterprise level, we have to reinforce the enterprise and the organizations that represent them. That's the most important thing. We also have today we're in a position to be able to plead for the development of enterprises and to work hand in hand with the United Nations system.
Thank you very much. Renata, we're hearing calls here for inclusiveness, transparency, and to work hand in hand. What would you like to see as Regional Vice President of Europe and Central Asia? What do you need and what do you want from the multilateral system?
Well, the first thing I want to say also to Guy Ryder is that the International Labour Organization is maybe today the one multilateral organization which works best, simply because it also involves the social partners who are the representatives and the link to the real economy as their constituents. And this is what we would like to see strengthened also in the other UN organizations. The United Nations do more and more policy work and frameworks which impact directly on employers and on workers. but they are only government-based. And we would like the social partners, which is not the same as civil society, but it's the social partners who actually take responsibility for what they do and for their collective agreements, for their commitment to the workforce as employers, to be included and involved in the policy making in fields which actually concern them directly. Let me give you an example. The UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights, which is now negotiated by governments only in the Human Rights Council, would benefit a lot from actually more inclusion and more consultation, a more active role from businesses and from employer organizations like the Ioe. This is why we have asked the UN to give Ioe and I2UC an observer status, because that is extremely important as a first step to be included in the institutional architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. Let me go to Hiroyuki also and get your view on what you think business wants and needs to better engage with the multilateral system.
Thank you for the question. And as Renata pointed out, multilateralism itself cannot be pursued without the real voice from the private sector, as well as workers' voice. And from our viewpoints, many UN agencies promote multilateralism, but it seems to me some of them are too idealistic. But they must be, to materialize their policies, programs, without listening real voice on the ground. That means we strongly believe our voices should be reflected in policy formulation together with workers' voices.
Thank you very much.
We understand that there's different views, but social dialogue need to be to try to have a consensus to respect other different views. That I would like to emphasis on at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiroki, indeed, for making that very clear to us. And briefly, let's hear from Alexandra again about, for your region, for Latin America, what does business want and need to be able to better engage with the multilateral system? And then we will hear from the Director General of the ILO. And Alexandra, if you would like to put your microphone on.
Yeah. Sorry for that. I forgot it. Como ya hicieron.
As our colleague said, the colleagues took the floor before me, one thing is quite sure. Recovery requires improving multilateral cooperation, that is global cooperation, and both the recovery of our sector as well as the priorities of societies as well. All this requires the cooperation of all the stake people with a real improvement of world social dialogue, since employers' organizations, businesses, governments, and civil society cannot do this by themselves. Only if we all stand together, we're ambitious, we want to find a solution that leaves no one behind. We have to help one another mutually. And I'm concerned by protectionistic measures. As in a commercial world, we are convinced that one should really defend multilateralism. That is, the employers employers' organizations play a clear-cut role in this, not just for the recovery due to the crisis and the achievement of the SDGs. We're not just social spokespeople or stakeholders, but we're a representative and legitimate voice of the enterprises before the international organizations, the businesses, and the United Nations. We're the ones that are being consulted by the governments on the economic and social measures to be able to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. We have a tremendous power to convene people, not just to address a limited number of multinationals, but address the great masses of small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the backbone of this economy. So I do believe that this is our message: an increase of social dialogue, an upswing of that, improvement of all social dialogue.
Free competition between members countries, with the elimination of the obstacles to international trade, for example, and allowing companies to access the foreign markets for goods and services more and more with affirmative and legally secure policies due to the particularities of each country. That's my opinion.
Thank you very, very much for giving that in 2 languages. Very impressive. I now turn to the Director General of the ILO, who has been listening intently and writing down some of your requests, some of your needs, so that business's voice can be heard better in the UN. But I know, Mr. Ryder, you would also like to say a few words about the key contribution that IOE has played in the past and also what you want to see from them in the future. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Claire. And of course, let me begin by congratulating warmly everybody at the IOE, the President, the Secretary General, the Vice Presidents, the colleagues in the room from the Secretariat, and all the members on this wonderful centenary and 100 years of achievement, which have rebounded, of course, to the benefit of employers around the world, but also to this organisation, the International Labour Organisation. Now, I've been asked to reflect very briefly in the time available on what the contribution of employers to the ILO has been over 100 years. It's a big task, isn't it? Well, the first thing to say is, you could not imagine, it's impossible to conceive of the ILO without the participation and effective representation of the employer community, exactly the representation that the IOE has coordinated over all of these years. But let me just dig a little bit underneath that. If you look at the beginnings of the ILO, I always refer to what I think of as the asymmetric genesis of the ILO. The ILO was designed and basically put in place by governments and workers. It was what the great Jean-Jacques Hirschlein, a former leader of the IOE, said, an unsolicited gift to the employers' community. But it was a gift which the employers chose to accept and to embrace. And this, I think, has a very important message for us even 100 years later. Because if you look at the mandate, the tasks of the ILO, that mission for social justice, for improvement of working conditions around the world, international regulation of working conditions through labour standards, you've got to ask yourself, well, where do employers come into this, and why have employers for 100 years embraced this mandate as they have? And there are different explanations, and we've had different things happening at different periods of the ILO's history. Let's have no illusions. The Bolshevik Revolution was a strong incentive in 1919 for the employers to get on board the ILO, no doubt about that. So ensuring decent work, as we now call it, is, I think, something of very basic importance to business. It is a precondition for stability in the world and ensuring the conditions under which enterprises can prosper. But we know that this has been called into question at different times in the history of the ILO. We know at the end of the Cold War that there was a debate amongst employers about whether it was worthwhile continuing with the ILO. Was its job completed with the end of the Cold War? And employers decided very decisively that they continued to see the value and continued to be committed to the work of the ILO. So the key issue here is the rationale, the business case, if you wish to put it in those terms, for employers' commitment to the organisation. This has to be continually renewed, considered. It has to be understood by those who work in the ILO and who are responsible for the Secretariat. And this has been very much a part of the dynamic of the ILO over 100 years. The second part of this, and it leads me on to what I hope will happen in the future 20 years, is the commitment of the employer community to work not alone in defence of their own very legitimate interests, but to engage in processes of social dialogue, tripartite cooperation with governments and workers. A piece of history, tripartism was born with the ILO. It's a reversal of the normal nature of historical process. Tripartism was an international construct which then filtered down to national practice. Normally history works in the reverse. But again, employers have committed to this process of social dialogue. Over the years, thanks to their effort and that of others, it has become a very good way of doing things at the national level. In many countries, but not all, an accepted way of conducting world of work business. Now, what do I hope will happen in the next 20 years? Well, for somebody with 2 years left in their mandate, it's a very generous offer for me to be invited to say what I hope will happen in the next 20 years, or indeed what employers should do. I've got some very simple things to say. I hope and trust that the commitment to the ILO's unchanging mandate, 100 years old, unchanged, will continue in the future. If it does not, nothing is possible. If that does happen, everything is possible. I hope that with that, and frankly, as relative bargaining position of power in labour markets shifts with structural changes in the world of work, employers remain fully committed to working with labour to come up with agreed solutions, ones that are fair and practical for world of work challenges. And I hope as well, and I'm very encouraged by what I've heard from the Vice Presidents already, that the firm commitment to multilateralism, to international cooperation, and let's not forget that the ILO was the very first specialised agency of the UN, which we predate, and we remain a very active team player in the UN. But never before, and we'll be hearing from the Secretary-General in a few minutes, and I suspect he might be saying this, never has multilateralism been challenged today. Never before has it been challenged as it has been challenged today. And if the employers' community's voice is raised in full defence of multilateralism, then I think you can have a powerful impact on those governments who may be, let's be honest, less than fully committed to the practice of multilateralism. And that leads me to the third point, Claire, that you put to me. How can we assure that the IOE and the employer community is properly and fully involved in UN processes beyond the ILO? I take this as a joint responsibility. What do I mean by that? It is the job of the ILO to advocate and to work within the UN system to ensure the proper arrangements for the full involvement of the employer and indeed labour community. And in these moments of UN reform, and many of you have been very deeply involved in these processes, we are doing that job, not always perfectly, but to the best of our ability, and it's ongoing. So we have to work out how the new UN development system, national level arrangements work out. We have also to work on the continuing generalised interface of the UN system and the employer community. There are many pieces to that interface. It's complex, it's sometimes dysfunctional. We have to work together to make it better. But the joint responsibility comes from the fact that it is the ILO's job to make space, to create the right infrastructure institutionally, but I think it is down to the IOE and its affiliates around the world to make use of those mechanisms and those spaces. And if we both do our job well and in coordination, I think we have some reason to believe that we can come out ahead in all of this. I know you've got an important guest coming soon, so I think I'll conclude my remarks at this point, Claire.
We've got an important guest, but we've also got all of the guests who are joining us around the world today. And I did promise at the beginning that we would take some of their questions. So we do have time for some questions. One has already come in from James Pearson, the CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which I think, Guy, the first part may be for you. Employers and employees will need to adopt new ways of working. How can labour laws be adapted quickly enough to allow them to change the way they work post-COVID without being penalised? Please.
Well, I mean, this is a great question and one very much on our minds at the moment. You know, even before COVID-19, and this came out of the ILO's Future of Work reflections during its own centenary, we were all aware of the transformative changes which are taking place in the world of work, be they in respect of technology, digitalisation, be they in respect of climate change and what we must do about it, demography, whatever it would be. And we all agreed in our centenary declaration at the ILO last year that we had to equip the world of work to navigate these transformative changes to best effect. COVID-19 comes on top of all of this. Some would argue that it's accelerating changes. Now, the answers, I think, to James's question lie mostly in what's written in the declaration. But let's be realistic. You know, facts and realities on the ground generally, I would say, always tend to get ahead of the capacity of institutions and those who seek to regulate change to manage them. We're always playing catch-up in that regard. But the ILO has extraordinarily important things to do here, be it in respect of international labour standards and regulatory frameworks, be it in constructing the agenda, and we've done a pretty good job of this over the last year, for how governments, employers and workers must navigate environmental changes, digital changes, etc. And there's one underlying message to all of this, and I'll conclude on this. Let us not believe that the future out there waiting for us, as it were, in the world of work is already designed for us. It is and can be and must be the result of conscious policy decisions taken by governments, employers and workers together. There isn't a future waiting for us. There is a future for us to construct. There is no fatal result out there. We must construct what we want. Build back better.
Thank you very much. And indeed, there was a second part of that question from the CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce, which was, is there an example where this has been done well, where these new labour laws have been adopted quick enough? And I throw that out to the regional vice presidents, and I am wondering whether any of you would like to come across the line with a good example where labour laws have been adopted quickly enough to change quickly without anyone being penalised. If somebody's got a good example, please come across the line now. Now, I was led to believe that perhaps Renata might have an answer from her region of Europe and the Central Asia, but if that's not the case, and I await to get a sign from her, I will quickly go back to Guy Ryder. Do you know of any good examples?
I want to take advantage, slightly distorting and deflecting the question, to bring a brilliant example of labour law reform which has taken place in the last days, which is a direct consequence of the work of the ILO. And that's what's happened in Qatar over the last week, where the government, having been pushed and shoved around by the ILO for a very long time, has adopted legislation on minimum wages, on migrant workers' regimes, where now we have eliminated the kafala system, the dangers of forced labour that go with it. It's one example. It doesn't quite correspond to the dynamic changes around technology and COVID, but it's an example of how the ILO, quickly enough you could dispute because it's taken us a while, but where the perseverance of workers, employers and governments together produces the type of legislative change that we need.
Let me introduce somebody who in fact needs no introduction to this audience, but the Secretary General of IOE, Roberto Suarez Santos, who would just like to pick up on that question before I conclude this session, and I'll be handing over to the President. Roberto.
Well, thank you again, and sorry for interfering in this exchange, but I felt like I should do it. We have been, as well as the ILO, having a follow-up of the different measures, especially the employment measures that have been put into place to prevent the devastating consequences of the pandemic. It's difficult to assess now whether these measures have been successful or not. What you can really say is that those governments, those countries who have effectively involved social partners have much ground behind them. I mean, they have really gained advantage. I can give examples of countries. I can give the country of my own country. I'm Spanish. For many of you, you could say that the measures that have been put into place are not at all ideal, and they are very controversial. But it's true that there was an involvement, and many other countries are following this path. I think that's the key value of social dialogue right now. If there is a sense of responsibility, there is also a scenario of much stability, further stability. You need a sense of responsibility from all sides on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And that leads me to conclude this session and to thank very much the Director General of the ILO, Guy Ryder, for being with us. Roberto Suarez Santos, of course, is going to stay with us for the next session. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to the President of the IOE, Errol Kirisepi.
Thank you, Claire, but I think we have to wait for the Secretary General to attend our meeting, and we have 2 more minutes.
Yes, he'll be here in about 3 minutes. Apologies for the delay.
Okay, thank you. As I have to address him, he has to be in the room. Let's say, we call it the room, of course.
Certainly. So I would just encourage everybody to not go away, although it is most probably the time for a cup of tea, at least in Europe. So you might want to get a cup of tea, but you're in the capable hands of the President of the IOE, who will introduce the UN Secretary General as soon as he arrives, because I think that we're all very keen to hear what he is going to say. Back to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Claire. Now, as you say, it's the time for tea, but we don't have time for tea because we have 1 minute to go, I believe. We are waiting, therefore, we don't have a tea break. We have to wait.
Roberto, perhaps you would like to summarize some of the key points that you've heard so far from your regional vice presidents, because I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Of course, I'm very familiar. That's my daily work, and I would be worried if I was not familiar. Yeah, I think there is a key message in this situation of uncertainty that we have. On one side, we see a new reality, a new scenario. Nobody can deny that. A new scenario for business. We were discussing that last year, isn't it? The new forms of work, the new forms of business, how this is changing, but now we are in a situation where multilateralism is questioned. Let's recognize it. And what we are saying, the way business collaborate with the UN is not just based on a fundraising approach. It's not just based on picking individual companies. At the end of the day, what matters is changing the policies. And in order to change the policies, you need someone representing them in an independent and representative manner. Thanks God, through the ILO, we managed to have this network at the origins of ILO. I mean, we are now beyond the ILO, but it's because we have this network of independent, I want to stress that, independent and influential business and employees organizations, that we can make a difference. That's what we want to understand, and I think that's the message that you have heard from all vice presidents in a way or in another. Okay.
Can I just ask you, I wonder whether you have some ideas of how do you want employers to get involved, for example, in the UN reform process, which is going on at the moment?
So listen, we have started already engaging with the resident coordinators at the ground level, because we realize that it's very often that they don't know us, they don't know our federations, or sometimes they know us, but they don't really engage because they think perhaps they prefer to engage with individual companies. Of course, we are also collaborating with the UN Global Compact, which is also a good partner for us in a complementary manner. But the need, again, to, on the ground, implement the UN reform on the basis of strong engagement with the resident coordinators, whose role has been strengthened in this UN reform, is key, is crucial. And that's what we are trying to do.
And indeed, we're going to hear from one of those UN resident coordinators who's been doing exactly that in Kenya later on, as I understand. Guy Ryder, as you're there and I can bring you back, I was wondering what role you see for employers in the UN reform process. There's this whole process of localization, which is part of this resident coordinator initiative.
Well, I think, Claire, there's no doubt, and I can sort of echo what Roberto's just said. We need to see full involvement of employers' organisations, the representative voice of employers, not just in New York and in the international sort of arena that the UN provides, but at the national level, where the real business of UN reform and the development system reform is at the national level. And it is absolutely essential, and we are working very hard, and it's not easy, I think it's fair to say. Firstly, the ILO has to sensitise resident coordinators, advocate, make the case at the national level that both employers and organised labour should be fully involved in national processes. And I think the balance sheet, to be very honest, Claire, is a mixed one. Sometimes the resident coordinators, they get it, and it works pretty well. And yes, the IOE and the trade unions are agile and alert enough and capable enough to take advantage of the spaces created. And sometimes that doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen as well as we would like. So I think, and I said it's a joint responsibility, and I repeat that we just have to work very, very hard to make sure that within the architecture that's been created, we have to make sure that where that's deficient, it's made better. We take full advantage of the opportunities provided and fill the space. It's no good winning the space in a system and then proving either unwilling or incapable of filling that space. So capacity building is another thing where both the IOE and the ILO can work to help this thing move forward.
I think we even heard this, didn't we, at the World Humanitarian Summit back in 2016, that businesses are saying, don't just see us as a check. We have got so much more knowledge than that we can bring to this. And of course, if we're going to meet the SDG 8, Roberto, it is that sort of knowledge that's going to help the SDGs be achieved.
I'm not going to look at you because I have been told to look at the camera who is there. At the end of the day, on one side is the advocacy role of the employers and business organizations, but also the expertise of companies. And we know very well who has this expertise within the network that we have. And that's a great also value that we have to take into consideration. Anticipating skill is one of the key examples. Yesterday we launched a report, and thank you, Guy, also for joining us on that. And we managed also to have a good output based precisely on the expertise of companies, our member federations, and put that together with the UN now for future action.
Thank you very much. And now it's my great pleasure to hand back to the President of the IOE.
Thank you, Claire. Dear Secretary General of the United Nations, we are greatly honored to have you here with us today at the Ioe Centenary Summit. Your participation is an important message. The UN and business need and will strengthen cooperation. Indeed, the IOE is member federations in 150 countries, and more than 50 million companies they represent have increased tremendously the engagement with the UN and its agencies. at the global level, where the IOE, together with our member USCIB, chairs the Business and Industry Group at the UN, as well as at local level, where we started a project together with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to improve collaboration with UN resident coordinators. Business is a strong supporter of multilateralism. A survey we undertook among our global membership for the UN 75 initiative shows the strong commitment and support of the global business community, small, medium, and large businesses combined, for the pursuit and promotion of multilateral relations. They deem these relations essential. The overriding feedback from employers is that they are committing to helping to build a sustainable future that addresses current global environmental and human development challenges. Today, we are proud to launch this report as the input of global business to the UN 75 initiative. COVID-19 is putting the UN and its 75th anniversary to its perhaps biggest tests. Now is the time for the UN and for all of us to deliver to ensure that the pandemic does not become a humanitarian catastrophe. Crises are opportunities to come forward with new ideas. This is the time to breathe new life into the multilateral system. The reforms we have launched, Mr. Secretary General, have made the UN system fit to meet this extraordinary challenge. Be assured that you have us on your side. Employers and also trade unions have a key role to play in minimizing the impact of the pandemic, in building back better and getting the world onto the path of meeting the Agenda 2030. Dear Mr. Guterres, thank you again so much for joining us today. We will first listen to your keynote intervention. Afterwards, IOE Secretary General Roberto Soares will lead a discussion with you, IOE Vice President Mthunzi Dwaba, Sanjita Reddy, the President of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, as well as Michelle Parmalee, Deputy CEO and Chief People and Purpose Officer from Deloitte Global. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. President Erol Kirizepi, Secretary General Roberto Soares Santos, Director General Guy Ryder, Presidents of the National Employers Organizations, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by congratulating the International Organization of Employers on its centenary. It is indeed a very old but an extremely representative business organization in the world. The IOE has made significant contributions to global policy making for economic and social progress, job creation, and a mutual beneficial business environment. I welcome your decision to focus the Centenary Summit on multilateralism. The IOE was among the first business organizations to engage directly with the multilateral system and has been an important pillar of the International Labour Organization since its earliest days. Today, the IOE actively supports the global vision for sustainable development. At a time when multilateralism is under severe strains, it is especially important that the IOE carries the commitment that it always had into its second century. This is also a timely opportunity to address the global employers and business leaders as what is arguably the most challenging period in generations. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken away hundreds of thousands of lives, infected millions and affected billions with little sign of retreat. And it has revealed fundamental global fragilities that extend far beyond health systems, fragilities that affect all our global institutions and multilateral efforts. We see it in the failed response to the climate crisis, in the rising inequalities, or in the lawlessness in cyberspace. These structural fault lines in our systems, policies, and institutions are being exposed at a time when many, and particularly the most disadvantaged, were already growingly anxious about their future. Today, our primary task is to defeat the pandemic and rebuild lives, livelihoods, businesses, and economies. We must reject the notion that there is a trade-off between health of people and the health of the economy. But we must not simply return to where we were before. We need to work together to build a better future, to protect workers and small businesses, to promote gender equality and create opportunities for youth. We need to share development gains more equitably, ensure that all people have an opportunity to fulfill their potential and that economies thrive. While there is still a long way to go in the fight against COVID-19, many countries have been able to contain the spread of the virus. That was made possible in part because of the cooperation of governments, businesses, trade unions, and many others. The pandemic has reminded us of both the power and the imperative of global cooperation. In the short term, governments, companies, and populations are understandably looking for solutions that will lead to a swift recovery. However, looking beyond, but starting now, we need to build economies and societies that are more inclusive and sustainable, in line with the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, where our challenge is clear: to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees and having global emissions halved by 2030 and carbon neutrality reached in 2050. The private sector is essential to all these efforts. So what can businesses do? First, to continue to engage with the multilateral systems through representative organizations to create a conducive global environment for decent work, investment, and sustainability. In the last few decades, multilateralism was vital in creating a world with open borders for trade, security, and prosperity. Today, as this is under threat, the private sector can play a pivotal role in showing that the world can be a better, more prosperous, and fairer place through international cooperation and the rules-based global economy. Second, engage with the United Nations at the national level to help secure that multilateralism works on the ground. UN reform will lead to more direct engagement with non-state actors at national level, including the private sector. Local and regional cooperation is a precondition for multilateralism to work globally. Third, businesses and employers organizations must actively participate in national and global private dialogue, public dialogue and initiatives, and there must be space for them to do so. The Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda cannot succeed without the full engagement of the private sector. The Business and Sustainable Development Commission found that companies could unlock $12 trillion in market opportunities by 2030 and created 380 million jobs by integrating the Sustainable Development Goals in the business strategies. Initiatives such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UN Global Compact, the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy are instrumental platforms to promote responsible business conduct. Fourth, do what you do best. Invest in businesses, jobs, and people, especially now when hundreds of millions of people have lost their livelihoods. You must continue to bring out the best of innovation and creativity in the service of people, help to build trust in business by doing the right thing at the workplace, in the communities, and globally. Ladies and gentlemen, today growing inequalities between and within countries boosted by the pandemic are fueling ethnic nationalism and protectionism. Combined with the anxieties about advancing drivers of change, this creates significant uncertainty about the future. To build a better future, we need a global multilateral system that answers the real anxieties of people with practical responses. And that requires a more inclusive multilateralism. Governments today are far from the only players in terms of politics and power. The business community, trade unions, local authorities, cities and regional governments, and so many others must assume more and more leadership roles in today's world. And they are doing it. The private sector and the employers' organization and those they represent have a real capacity to make a meaningful difference and ensure a more effective multilateralism. But they must be given the space to do so. Each and every one of you is key to making it happen, Thank you for your commitment, and it is indeed an enormous pleasure to be here celebrating your centenary.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your encouraging word. I think that the last point that you have underlined, that we should be engaging, but we should also have a space to engage with you, is very helpful for us. Let me bring here 3 participants who want to raise specific questions and points to you. May I first introduce to you Mr. Mtunsi Mduaba. He's our Vice President for the ILO, but also the employer's spokesperson in the ILO. Among his responsibilities, also he is the chair of Productivity South Africa. He's South African. And the mandate of this organization is also to promote growth and productivity in line also with the SDGs. But above all, and I want to stress that, because he says that very often, he's a servant leader with a global spirit. He has proved to do that among us, and he wants to make some remarks. Mtunsi, you have the floor. You have 2 minutes and a half. Thank you.
Well, good morning, SG. I have 2.5 minutes, but I'm also being warned that we're running late, so my 2.5 minutes might have to be 1.5 minutes. But good morning to you. Good morning to colleagues I haven't seen for a while who are connected. I think I saw Guy. Hello, Guy. Good afternoon to you, Roberto, and everybody else. Now, I've listened to you, SG. I've heard you talk about a number of areas that I was hoping to also cover. But really and truly, Roberto, in his introduction, has also made you aware of the different areas I work in. I also work very closely with Madame Michelle Bachelet in a different capacity where we do business human rights and responsible business conduct. And I heard you talk about an inclusive policy making and people being given space and so on. And now I come to the part where you're supposed to look very surprised, because I know you've got my question, but I have to say it so that other people can hear it as well. Mr. Secretary General. And the question is, in your opinion, what can social partners bring to the UN? How important are the social partners to inclusive policy making and to ensure that this is not getting lost to UN reform? How do we ensure real impact and consequent social justice? I stop there, Mr. Secretary General. That's 1.5 minutes, so my people should be happy.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I will probably answer more a related question. And that is, how can we build the institutional frameworks to allow for effective participation of employers and also of the social partners in general in the multilateral system? I was Prime Minister of Portugal. And one of the things that really worked quite well was the social dialogue in my country. It was institutionalized. There was a council in which the employers, the trade unions, and the government were represented. We had every year an agreement. That agreement would cover different areas, from fiscal policy to social security areas, to questions of labor legislation, etc. And those agreements would then be impacted, with an impact on the policies and on the laws and on the budgets and on the other measures that were taken by governments and by parliament. Now, what we have now in the multilateral system is essentially an intergovernmental system. And the ILO is the only exception in which entrepreneurs and the trade unions are represented at the same level of governments. What I would like to see, and I've been talking about inclusive multilateralism, is to have multilateralism in which not only governments are represented, but in which there are institutional spaces created for the businesses, for also local authorities, for the trade unions, and for other social and regional actors. And in my opinion, this is needed at the level of the United Nations. It needed at the level of the Bretton Woods system. It needed at the level of the World Trade Organization. All multilateral institutions should have platforms, and I've been fighting for it, and I would like to have the private sector engaged in this fight, because power is never given. It needs to be taken. No? And governments are very reluctant to give power on this. Absolutely. But we need to establish at global level the same kind of mechanisms that worked so successfully in my country, making the social partners be very influent in the definition of the policies and in its implementation. And of course, this is relevant in all aspects. It's relevant, namely, when we have programs of recovery for the COVID-19 for our economies. When we have to discuss questions related to education training, when we have to discuss questions related to taxation, when in all those aspects that now have a global dimension, I would like to see beyond the role that the ILO does, and that is very important, but it is limited. I would like to see, and I've been saying it to governments, I would like to see institutional frameworks for social partners and for the business community in particular to participate at decision-making level in multilateral organizations. And this idea that governments are the only institutions that manage the world is finished. It is clear that governments have a role to play, but today the business community, today cities, today social organizations have a role that can not be neglected. And if intergovernmental organizations look only at the cooperation of governments, they will completely fail in addressing the challenges that we have, be it the pandemic, climate change, the situation of cyberspace, and others. So I would sincerely like to see opening in governments, and I ask you to lobby strongly governments for this, to accept our proposals to have an inclusive multilateralism, and I think these would change things. And these would allow international conventions. These would allow the decisions taking at different levels in the UN General Assembly or in the Bretton Woods system, the World Trade Organization, and many other international institutions. These would allow to be much more linked to the realities of the economies and the societies we are dealing with.
Mr. Secretary General, I believe us, we will be strongly lobbying on this direction. We are already doing that. We have another person who wants to raise you a question. She is Sangeeta Reddy. She is the president of FICCI. FICCI is the Indian Chambers of Commerce. FICCI was one of those organizations which struggle for the independence of the country, but also which has been also very active bringing the country to an emerging economy. And of course, they are very much on the skills area, on the informality challenges being also dealt by the business community. She has been very active also with us, also during the ILO Global Summit. Sangeeta, thank you again for joining us. You have the floor.
Good afternoon and namaste. Greetings from India. So it is well known that all of us are in a storm. And while we are in the same storm, everyone is not in the same boat. And so today I want to call attention that while businesses of all sizes have been affected by COVID, and we have seen trade barriers, movement restrictions, we've seen a breaking down of supply chains and truly livelihoods put at risk, but especially the MSME, the micro, small and medium sector, which represents 90% of all businesses and a significant portion of employment worldwide. In emerging countries, MSMEs contribute 40% of GDP and create 7 out of 10 jobs. It is for this sector that I raise my voice today, and I'm honored to be speaking to you. But my submission is that the private sector must strengthen our partnership with the United Nations to ensure that businesses, government, civil society put their momentum behind the informal sector in general, and especially behind women-led businesses. Very quickly, sir, I want to also submit that the pandemic has revealed fault lines in the health system. And while countries move ahead towards SDG 3, we need to have a significant rethink in the way we're accessing health. And while in India, there's a significant movement to cover 500 million people with our universal health insurance, we must think of prevention, especially of non-communicable disease, of biosurveillance, of the use of digital, especially telemedicine, to accelerate the digital backbone and the use. It's a time to innovate, to be inclusive, and definitely a compulsion to create impact. So, sir, I have one quick request, which is a special referendum from the United Nations, acknowledging the role of healthcare workers, especially nurses, who are the backbone. And then, as President FICCI, the apex industry with over 300,000 businesses, I would like to ask, number one, how can we create a more collaborative agenda with the United Nations to develop a joint call for action towards a more favorable normal for inclusivity? And second, how can private organizations like FICCI become a part of the private sector constituency of the United Nations to impact issues like employment, health, education, gender equality, the digital divide, and significantly skills development, because the new world needs new skills. Thank you so much for this opportunity to interact with you.
Thank you very much. I think there are two dimensions in your question. One is about how to establish effective partnerships, and the second is a very particular concern with the informal sector. I would like to strongly encourage businesses at all levels and of all dimensions to join the Global Compact. The Global Compact has now thousands of companies. The Global Compact works together with the UN. Of course, it's independent and it's managed by the business community in itself. It has a global board and it has the national networks. And the idea is to have the Global Compact having a stronger and stronger influence in relation to UN policy making at global level. But now resident coordinators in each country have the obligation to be in close contact with the Global Compact to allow for the UN action in each country to have a very strong input from the business community in the way we deal with governments in relation to, namely, the implementation of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, and in relation to all the plans of recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And beyond the Global Compact, we have a number of other platforms that we have been pushing for. And now looking into the bigger companies, we have two groups that in relation to climate change have been very important. One group is the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance that represents $5 trillion US. The other group is the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance that also represents a very meaningful number of large companies in relation to these objectives. And then a number of partnerships at all levels for different purposes. And in relation to women, there is a win-win program called Win-Win Program that Gender Means Good Businesses, that is managed together by UN Women with the private sector, and that shows that this kind of partnerships, there is the Microsoft UNICEF partnership on the GIGA project, aiming at making all schools be linked to the internet in 2030. So there is a number of concrete, and I could go on and on with, when I was in UNHCR, we developed a number of very important partnerships with the private sector in relation to the support to refugee communities and to integrate also refugees in the capacity to generate their own businesses. So there is a lot that can be done. But I have a particular concern with the informal sector. Let's be frank. In many countries in the world, and to a certain extent, largely in international institutions, the informal sector has been ignored, as if it doesn't exist. And, well, some countries even try to repress it, but mostly they ignore it. And the truth is that the informal sector in many countries represents a huge share of the economy, and it's the informal sector that keeps the countries afloat, to be honest. Without the informal sector, the economy would completely succumb. And it's the informal sector that allows many people to survive, sometimes in extremely difficult circumstances. So what I think we need is a partnership at national level between governments. UN agencies can help that, and the private sector organizations must play a role on that. And at global level, involving both international financial institutions, the UN, your IOE, the other, the Global Compact and others, to see if we can have a roadmap of measures to make the informal sector be progressively more and more integrated in the mainstream economy. And that means to have a number of very specific programs in training of entrepreneurs and training of employees, programs of integrating in supply chain systems, mechanisms to expand social protection, innovative forms of support, and progressively make attractive for the informal sector also, with less bureaucracy, with very simple procedures, to integrate in the economy, the mainstream economy. I do believe this should be a priority, because to ignore the informal sector, especially in a moment like the COVID-19, in which the informal sector is the most directly negatively impacted, and it has no instruments. It has no instruments to respond. Ignoring the informal sector is a suicide in relation to the development of our economies. And the investing in this progressive integration of the informal sector in the mainstream economy is the best way, in my opinion, to also achieve more inclusivity, more equality, better social cohesion, and more effective economies and societies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guterres, for your time. There is a final, very, very final question, if you allow us perhaps some minutes more, which is going to be raised by the Deputy CEO of Deloitte, Michel Parmelet, who is also the Vice Chair of our American member, USAIB. I don't want to take more time. Michel, you have the floor.
Thank you for the opportunity for me to be here today. The coronavirus pandemic has taken its toll in many ways, not the least of which has been on our education systems. Schools around the world have been forced to close, and instruction where available has largely become virtual. Young people report that they are learning less since the outbreak, and we know that the negative impact has been the greatest for those who lack access to the internet and technology or a proper setting at home to study. Before the pandemic, access to quality education and job opportunities in communities around the world was far from equal. Globally, around 263 million children and youth, that's 1 in 5, were already out of school, with girls being more likely than boys never to set foot in a classroom. And the pandemic and the associated economic recession have only made things worse. Although it's too soon to know the full extent of the pandemic's impact on learning and development, we do know that business can play a critical role in mitigating it. The business community is well positioned to address the inequity and disparities that exist in education globally. At my organization, Deloitte, we believe that every child should have the opportunity to dream big dreams. Success in life shouldn't be up to luck. And that is why we launched a program in 2018 that we call World Class. Our ambition is to impact 50 million futures by 2030, but we realize we cannot get there on our own. That is why we're collaborating with businesses, governments, education innovators, nonprofits, and NGOs to form ecosystems. These ecosystems focus on two things: helping people expand and improve their knowledge and skills, and providing them access to opportunities for meaningful employment in the future. We know from experience that this collaborative approach works. Our world-class program has already reached nearly 12 million young people, but there is still so much to do, especially given the disparities that the pandemic has exacerbated. This brings me to my question, Secretary General. How can business and the United Nations make sure that the COVID-19 crisis doesn't result in a lost generation? What steps can we take in this environment to continue preparing and bringing youth into the labor market? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We did, during these last few months, a number of policy briefs involving most of the UN agencies, trying to give guidance to governments in a number of areas. And I think the most successful of the policy briefs that we have published was exactly on education, because it is a central question in the COVID-19 impact on society. Now, one thing that is clear is that the digital divide has been terrible in the world as a factor of increased inequality in the COVID situation. Half of the world population has no access to internet, and that is why one thing that I believe is crucial, and it's our program GIGA, its objective is to make sure that we connect all schools to the internet in the shortest possible period, because to allow for everybody to have access to the internet is a key instrument. Second aspect, even with the potential of virtual education, I would say that governments must give priority to create the conditions for safe education in school. And obviously, I'm not going to be demagogic and say, let's open the schools and forget about everything else. No, but to invest in creating the conditions for education to be done in school in safety in the COVID context is, I think, essential. Because it's completely different to be at home or to be in school with other children, with the teachers. It's completely different. And so this is something that must be a priority. I'm not asking for irresponsible opening of schools. I'm talking for a massive investment in creating the conditions for safe education in school. Then there is another question that I think is essential. Many of our education systems teach us things. Now, what is important is not to learn things, is to learn how to learn. Nobody will have the same profession in life. I myself have had several, and I am already 71. So when I see my grandchildren, it's clear they will not have the same profession in life. So people need to be able to learn how to learn. So the role of education, and it will be more and more lifelong learning than education in itself in the traditional way, must be to prepare people to change, to adapt. And here is where I see a very clear connection between the educational systems and society. I think that, we had many training centers in my country, run by the state. I see training programs much more effective when they are done in companies. And when the investment in training is done, making people train in companies. And at the same time, creating mechanisms for incentives in relation to the integration of young people that come out of school into the labor market. Because one of the terrible problems we have today is the number of people that go out, especially with the degrees, and then they don't find a job because their qualifications are not in line with the needs of the different economic activities. So a very close association between the private sector and the government institutions in linking education and training and making training essentially done inside the private sector or inside the companies themselves is, I think, extremely important. And then I believe we need to look into how to make job creation more attractive in different aspects. And I'll give you a more revolutionary suggestion. We still have large part of our tax systems based on payroll, on income tax and income tax based on payroll. If we shift income tax from payroll to carbon tax, we have a win-win situation. We are penalizing the pollution and we are making labor costs lower. So there is a number of things that I believe can be done, linking the educational systems, the training systems, and the job creation mechanisms, including the different aspects of the fiscal environment, in which a close consultation between the private sector and government and at global level in the definition of global parameters, this close consultation can, in my opinion, create a number of very innovative solutions, because the present systems, let's be clear, the present systems, with very few exceptions, are dysfunctional. People are in school learning things that are not adapted to the changing world in which we live, and the transition between school, training programs, and jobs is not well oiled. I mean, it's not well managed in the majority of our societies. And this should be, in my opinion, the center of the cooperation between the private sector and government institutions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General, for your time, allocating your time and your insights, some of them revolutionaries, but we'll take that very seriously. We look forward also to engage with you. Precisely now, we have the Executive Director of the Global Compact, the recently appointed Madame Sanda Ojinabo, together with the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Organization and a resident coordinator, because we want precisely to look forward in this collaboration. We need your help, we need your support, and we really appreciate the fact that you have engaged with us in this special moment for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
We are still very young in the UN, compared.
Now I give the floor to Claire to start the next session. Claire, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and indeed to trailing ahead to some of the invitees for our next session, which is Business and Multilateral Relations. And indeed, this afternoon, we've been talking about the UN Global Compact. You heard the UN Secretary General making some remarks about how important that was. We've heard about these resident coordinators, and we are going to hear from representatives from two of those organizations. But first, I'm going to ask Sharon Barrow, who's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, because we've been hearing that businesses want to have a seat at the UN table. They believe in multilateralism. And of course, the focus is on achieving the SDGs. So Sharon, I would like to ask you, I know that with the IOE, last year, you made a joint appeal to the UN General Assembly that you work very closely together. I wonder if you can tell us what you've been doing together to deliver on the SDGs.
So, first of all, let me say to you that we are delighted to be in partnership with the IOE around this question. As the actors in the real economy, I think Renata put that very clearly in the last session, that we have something to offer. And multilateralism in and of itself is in trouble if we can't see a broader contribution from social partners. Then I think the trust in multilateralism will flounder even more. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, then for us, there's no doubt that if we want to rebuild the social contract, if we want to implement the Centenary Declaration of the ILO to put a valuable floor of security and opportunity under workers who contribute to the wealth of the world, given that the Director General just, in fact, addressed the breakdown in the labour market with the huge informality now sitting at 60%, and of course including many new forms of work like internet-mediated business, platform business, etc., under many names. So the SDGs that we think are fundamental and we have and need a partnership around are, of course, Goal 8. Decent work, full employment, these questions are fundamental to an economy. Goal 5, if we don't represent and demand an inclusion of women in the global economy, we're missing massive opportunities for jobs and for productivity. Goal 1, you cannot build a resilient future with a jobs crisis that needs massive investment in jobs, in industry, in our public services, if we don't have universal social protection to provide fundamental security. And of course, 3 and 4 being health and education. Again, vital for business, vital for workers. But that is absolutely complemented by the sustainability goals and the imperative of climate action and just transition. So achieving, for us, the SDGs, working hand in hand with business to rebuild our economies with a resilience and a rights base is fundamental to rebuilding a social contract and a secure economic outlook for the future.
Sharon, thank you very much for your thoughts there on how important it is for this social contract, as you say, to deliver on the SDGs. I would like to bring into the conversation Siddharth Chatterjee, UN Resident Coordinator in Kenya. And I understand you've been quite vocal in your calls for more business presence at the UN. Could you also tell us what you've been doing with IOE and business during these challenging times?
Well, thank you very much for having me on this particularly important centenary of the IOE, and big congratulations to IOE. Perhaps it's important to start with an anecdote, since I see my sister Sanda Ojiambo there, and it's important to put this context of what actually led to the UN in Kenya partnering up with 6 companies, GlaxoSmithKline, Safaricom, Huawei, Kenya Healthcare Federation, Philips, and Merck. We joined up as the UN family with these 6 companies to deal with the burden of maternal mortality in 6 of the highest burden counties. I mean, these 6 counties contributed to 50% of the maternal deaths. This was a first. It was a first for companies to actually come together with the UN system, but to go to areas which are traditionally highly marginalized, very unstable. They used to see the scourge of, well, they still do, the scourge of cross-border terror attacks from Somalia. In a matter of 2.5 years, we were able to also unlock about $15 million of funding from a trust fund. We were able to reduce the maternal mortality ratios by 1/3. Now, let me put this into context. In my own country, India, that would have taken somewhere close to 10 years to do that. Because what we did was we impacted the national maternal mortality ratio average, which was 488 deaths per 100,000 live births, and brought it down to 360. So we realized early on, as way back as 2014, 2015, the strength in a partnership between the UN system and the private sector, and which got me invited to the World Economic Forum in 2017, along with the county health executives and the governors of these particular counties. And then that led to the establishment of a public-private partnership platform at the UN General Assembly by then Kenya's Foreign Minister, Amina Mohammed. And this has now become one of the most vibrant platforms, which has brought together close to 400 companies. And what we are trying to do, and the role of the UN here, is essentially as a convener, as a connector, and as a catalyzer. We de-risk. We de-risk by moral authority, not with the cash resources we bring to the table. And this is where the Secretary General's reforms are so critical, because he has empowered me as his resident coordinator to undertake this discussion across the UN system, we are 25 UN funds, agencies, funds, and programs. And what we can do is actually galvanize and use the resource base of the private sector. And what does the private sector really bring? Big data, technology, and innovation. How do we harness that together with our moral presence, work with the governments, and make sure that we don't do it as a projectized approach, but impact the lives of millions? And this is what our program is currently doing. So essentially, our relationship with IOE and business is intrinsic. It has grown and evolved organically. But over time, this relationship has now been, by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in Sweden, has been declared a best practice. What we need to be doing is the renaissance of multilateralism, exactly the thing that has been discussed earlier by the Secretary General. And the new form of multilateralism will be where the public-private sector come together and the UN becomes that enabling body of leaving no one behind. Over to you.
Siddharth, thank you very much for that concrete example and indeed the success of that maternal mortality reduction campaign. Part of this SDG partnership platform, do you see this as a role model that could be scaled up and replicated across other parts of the UN? We were hearing from Guy Ryder earlier that not all UN resident coordinators might be quite so open, if I'm not putting words in his mouth, to working with business. You obviously are. So would you like to see other UN resident coordinators following the Kenyan example?
Thank you for that question. You know, you've heard the UN Deputy Secretary General too making a clarion call to every resident coordinator in the world. She has said, flip the orthodoxy, which means we have to be unconventional. This is 10 years away from the accomplishment of the SDGs. It's the decade of action. We just have to do things differently. And doing things differently means resident coordinators, we as resident coordinators have to be far more agile and ambidextrous. We need to be able to inform the government with the finest intellectual capital in terms of public policy and how to implement it. And yet with the UN country team, reach the furthest behind. And Sanda will tell you that, you know, we've gone into places where there was an absence of government. We've gone into places where it was considered highly risky. But because of that dexterity that we've been able to bring in, we've been able to reach other milestones. So absolutely, yes, that chapter of, today the COVID-19 rivals the Great Depression that we saw earlier. No government, the wealthiest government, will not be able to put resources in terms of the development programming, which we've seen traditionally happen in low-income countries. That chapter is over. The new model of partnerships is going to be public-private partnerships. And I'll just tell you for one simple reason. The median age of Africa is 18. The population of Africa at this moment is 1.2 billion. By 2050, this will be 2.3 billion, of which 850 million will be young people. It is here that we will reap the demographic dividend. So we need a Marshall Plan of the same ambition that we saw post-Second World War happen in Africa. It will only happen with the private sector. So this is actually the real time for enabling those relations to take place. So as an RC, I would encourage all the other 128 resident coordinators, this is the way to go. Over to you.
Siddharth, thank you very much. I think that message is received loud and clear. And indeed, let me bring Sanda Ojiambo, Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, into the conversation. We've heard the UN Secretary General praise your efforts engaging so many companies as members. We've heard Siddharth mention you too. Now, I understand that you're a relative newcomer, so I was just wondering what for you has been striking about the efforts to bring the UN closer to business over the past 6 months, and how do you see the cooperation evolving over time?
Thank you very much. Let me first start by congratulating Ioe on this very important milestone of its centenary. And, sincere greetings to my good friend Sid, who, although we're actually in the same city right now, haven't seen each other for a while due to COVID, and to all the other esteemed panelists. As you said, I'm new to role. I'm about 2 months in, but I'm not new to the Global Compact. I've watched and interacted with the Global Compact for close to 10 years. And it's really struck me the importance of the role that continuing to bring business closer to the business of the UN and certainly closer to the business of the Sustainable Development Goals has what it's done in terms of reaping success, as well as also opening a clear pathway for business and truly a pathway to prosperity. I think purpose-led business that is guided by the SDGs is truly the type of business that makes a change, not just for business benefit, but also for societal transformation. And I think really that's what the UN Global Compact aims to do. Partnerships such as that with the Ioe also help us really further our focus on a couple of key principles. But over the last 6 months, I think the world literally has been turned upside down. No country has been left untouched and unimpacted by COVID. I think for most businesses, what has been really core is health and safety of employees, business continuity, actually even business survival in some cases. Around the world, millions have lost jobs, millions of SMEs have shut down. And I think the informal sector that the Secretary General spoke so passionately about earlier literally is in need of a massive rebuild, because for many economies, it is the informal sector that drives forward. So, what have we seen businesses do, I think, in the Global Compact? We've seen businesses really reflect back on what we call the 10 principles. You have to do business, even under the pressures of COVID, that respects human rights, that respect labor, that respect, environmental stewardship, and certainly that, condone corruption. Because that principle-led business is what allows a business to then really engage in the rebuild and the recovery that we need post-COVID. At the Global Compact, we issued a special appeal to business, really talking about the need to focus business on the 10 principles. We also took advantage of the whole virtual and digital shift to do a couple of online sessions with companies and business leaders, really talking honestly about the impact that COVID had on their business, as well as sharing openly strategies for rebuild and recovery. With over 20,000 plus viewers, we think that this really helped impact, from a thought leadership perspective, what the role of business would do. But let me reflect on a very important partnership that Sid has highlighted, which is truly our partnership with the UN country teams, because we really need to work a lot closer with country teams to drive that holistic response, to COVID, to other sustainable development issues, and really help drive forward countries' development. So that's been a snapshot of my 6 months. I truly am excited about the opportunity to continue to work stronger and better with UN country teams. Truly also excited about the continued partnership with Ioe.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm just going to ask you, Sander, and each of the contributors for literally 30 seconds. We're hearing the whole time about building back better. Sander, in a few words, what does building back better mean for you?
First, I would push the definition a little bit further, building forward better. I think we want to challenge what back was. I think we're looking for a new frontier where we're very focused on a green economy growth. We're focused on inclusive business models. We're focused on rebuilding the SME sector, including the informal sector. We're very focused on these fundamental inequalities that I think are really tearing apart our social safety nets. We're focused on rebuilding a strong safety net too.
Siddharth, so perhaps it's not build back better, but build forward better. A few words on what that means for you.
Well, in this case, it means it is a renaissance. I would compare it to the same inflection point that Catholicism saw through the period of the Renaissance and which led to a transformation of Catholicism. It has to be seen with that sense of urgency and vibrancy and dynamism. I think building back better is when we put the lens, particularly in Africa, on young people and particularly women and girls, because sub-Saharan Africa loses $95 billion year on year because of inequality, because of lack of opportunities for women. And there will be no reaping of a demographic dividend in Africa unless men and women share an equality of rights, have the same opportunities that advances GDPs and advances nation states. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And let me give the last word before I hand back to Roberto Suarez Santos. Sharon Burrow, obviously you work very closely with the Ioe. Let me give you the last word then. What does build back better or build forward better mean for the International Trade Union Confederation?
I'm with Sandra. If we don't build forward better, then, and we don't include people, and I would say this to the resident coordinators here, if you don't include all the partners, you won't rebuild trust, let alone those fundamentals of that need to be put in place that have excluded people on the previous model. So business needs to change. We all need to be in this together. But we must, in fact, look beyond the traditional boundaries and say, how do people feel that they can trust us, trust their governments, trust the future? So definitely building forward better. The SDGs are at the frame. I would argue with the Ioe that we need the Ioe Centenary Declaration implemented in full so we build a better and stronger labour market set of institutions, and that we have a rights-based future people can trust. It will take rethinking on everybody's part, and it will take partnerships that are often not so comfortable, but we must make that happen. And I would say again to on UN reform, social dialogue, social dialogue, social dialogue. We are used to collective bargaining. That's how we get agreements and get things done. The negotiations in Qatar got an agreement, and we were then all on the design team. We got it done. Kafala is dead. No more forced labour. Well, I can tell you there are a lot of exploitative situations in the world we need to tackle equally, and we look forward to working to see the principles of the Global Compact are certainly implemented in that framework. So welcome, Sandra. Congratulations, Ioe. And let's indeed build forward better.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Sander. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I'm going to hand over to the Secretary General of Ioe for his final remarks or the headlines from this afternoon's discussion.
I'm going to save that because of the sake of time. I just want also to thank the other participants, and special thanks to Guy Ryder also, who has been also attending all this session and also helping us with the setting as an organization, ILO. And now, with all your permission, there are some questions that have been raised. We will answer. Be reassured that we will answer the questions that you have heard, you have provided in the chat channel. And now it's for Errol to make the formal final remarks. Thank you so much. Errol, you have the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues. Well, this has not been the Centenary Summit we would have imagined at the beginning of the year. The last months have challenged all of us to an unprecedented extent. I am sure, and this summit has shown this, that the IOE will come stronger out of this crisis. The organization has proven to react very agile to the pandemic and has very quickly developed not only digital means to serve the interests of their members and of the global business community, but also played an important role within the ILO, the UN, the G20, and many other forums to address the impact of the pandemic. One of the many activities is, for instance, the joint initiative of the IOE, ITUC, Industry All, many brands and retails, as well as local employer federations and trade unions, to address the impact of the pandemic in the garment industry. We work together to support manufacturers to survive the economic disruption caused by the COVID-19 and to protect garment workers' income, health, and employment. What we see is a huge willingness to work together across the different stakeholders. We all need to make sure that we take this constructive approach, this commitment for collaboration, over into post-COVID times. The manifesto we launched today is not an aim in itself, but it is the North Star for the IOE and its members. We are ending this summit with the commitment to follow up and implement the manifesto. This summit is not the only or last event for our centenary. We already had a number of very high-level digital centenary thematic events. Only yesterday, we launched in a Centenary Skills Summit a major study on the skills of the future. The time also will come back where we meet again in person. The big IOE Centenary Party will take place next June. Yes, it will be then our 101st anniversary. I call it 100+1 anniversary. This November, the world-famous Geneva Mont Blanc Bridge will have the IOE flags to honor the history and role of the organization. We will launch a book about the last 100 years of the IOE, and we'll have upcoming a photo exhibition. Many other events will follow. For now, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, for your commitment to the IOE, for your willingness for collaboration, and say, stay safe and keep well. I hope to meet you all again in one of the upcoming events. Au revoir to all of you. Until next time.